So we haven't talked about the plan and document perspective on software maintenance. I think if you look at the things that we've just done for approaching legacy code, refactoring, using BDD to fill in characterization tests at a high level, using TDD as part of the refactoring process, those are sort of all ingredients that come from Agile. I mean, if you think about it, you're doing all those same things when you're developing new code, as well as having them be helpful when you're approaching legacy code. So what are the differences between what software maintenance looks like in a more traditional top-down plan and document software engineering project versus how we have been looking at them in the Agile process? Development versus maintenance, basically the costs are very similar, right? Most of the cost of software goes into the maintenance phase. Most of the cost of maintenance goes into enhancements as opposed to going into bug fixes. So in P&D, one of the main differences is that there's more of a separation between the people doing the maintenance and the people doing the code development, and the way that maintenance looks at documentation before code gets written. So a typical arrangement might be that in a P&D scenario, the customers might pay a separate software support or maintenance fee in the form of a subscription or something like that, and that is sort of explicitly set aside for maintenance operations. And very often, the team that is in charge of that part of the relationship may not be the team that did the original development. So there is a manager that is separately handling the maintenance of the software. There are engineers who are dedicated to doing that, who may not be the same or may not have much overlap with the team that did the development. And unfortunately, in traditional projects, sometimes those are kind of less glamorous roles than being the development engineers or the development manager, which is unfortunate because when you think about it, if maintenance is most of the expense and most of the life cycle, you would think that it would be just as important. And so I think one of the things that I appreciate about Agile is that just as there's not as much of a distinction between the developers and the operators, as we talked about when we talk about DevOps, similarly, there is much less of a distinction between the developers and the maintainers. Because in Agile, you're sort of embracing change on all time scales, and maintenance during the software's deployment is just one more example of that on a longer time scale. So what are these jobs like? The maintenance manager's job is structurally sort of similar to the development manager because they have to estimate the costs of implementing customer enhancements. They have to schedule how long it'll take. They will have to evaluate risks. All the same things you have to do when you're planning the project. And you have to recruit the engineers who are going to be doing this. And of course, you have to evaluate them. So basically, a lot of the same technical considerations. But you also have to have a maintenance plan. And this is a plan that basically says, how are you going to not only maintain the code, but maintain the technical documentation so that they match up? Not surprisingly, there is an IEEE standard to follow for doing this, because IEEE seems to have standards for just about everything. So the maintenance process in plan and document as opposed to the development process, the software is now in the field. So that means that if you do a new release, you can't break features that customers depend on. A thing that I like about doing software as a service is the software is sort of always in the field. So there isn't really a notion of doing a breaking change in the same respect. Customer collaboration is somewhat different. The more generally heavier reliance on the customer contract means that there's a more formal process to follow when the customer asks for a change and you can't do all the changes asked for by all the customers. How do you decide what to prioritize? How you respond? We'll talk about the change control board in a moment. How do you respond when the customers make these requests? There's a formal process for the customer to make a request. They get tracked just like they were a bug report, and those are evaluated by a change control board, which has people other than the maintenance manager on it, and their job is to estimate the cost and the time of doing each change request with the manager's help. The QA team is supposed to estimate how long it will take to test because, as we've said, in more traditional top-down projects, often the responsibility for testing in QA is more separated from developers as compared to Agile. There's a documentation team whose job it is to make sure the documentation is in touch with what the product actually does, so they have to give an estimate for what they think it will cost to do those updates. And there's also a customer support group that essentially is, think of them as the voice of the customer in the Agile world. They're the ones trying to figure out how urgent this is and how bad would it be if it didn't get fixed. So how many of their customers are sort of severely impacted by this? If the change request is urgent, maybe there's no time to do all those other pesky updates to documentations and stuff like that. You just got to get the code fixed. So if customers are having code crashes or losses of data, if you're in a regulatory environment and new laws affect the product, for example, when some of the legislation from the European Union about cookies and privacy happened, websites sort of had to scramble to more transparently indicate how they're managing your cookies. That's why you get those annoying little pop-ups now that say opt out of non-essential cookies and so forth. Obviously, if there's a security hole, that is an urgent patch because customers' data might be at risk, even if that occurs in an underlying library or some other piece of code the product depends on. Maybe the competitors came out with a new feature, and if you don't also put the feature in, your customer might switch. But basically, again, in an agile world, you're always sort of trying to respond to change quickly and incrementally. So the notion of urgent change requests is sort of happening on a finer granularity. It's a little bit more cumbersome, I guess, where you're doing a release cycle that's longer, because after you've dealt with the emergency, now you have to sort of find the time to sync everything back up, right? So bring the plans up to date, bring the documentation up to date, as opposed to sort of doing things in smaller increments and updating all of those things together. And where does that leave time to refactor? Because one of the issues I think that I like with Agile is that the same techniques you use in building code can be applied all the time to refactor your code as you go, doing continuous integration and continuous deployment as you improve the code structure. But this is sort of by definition an activity that doesn't add customer value. Customers don't see the results of refactoring, generally speaking. So, whose job is it to decide when it's worth spending time on this? Because it's time that theoretically could be spent working on something that a customer directly asks for. What about re-engineering? So refactoring is a way to improve maintainability, and you try to keep refactoring as you go so that your code sort of never accumulates too much technical debt, as it's called. Technical debt is basically a way of saying, we know the code's ugly, but it was an emergency, and we had to fix it, and we had no choice, but we'll come back and fix it and make it look nice later, right? And as we all know, later doesn't always come. So one question is there a time to just sort of, throw things out and start over? Are there, big changes like changing the database schema, or by reverse engineering the code, write the documentation that has gotten badly out of date? Essentially, try to reverse engineer what the documentation should have said based on what the code is actually doing. So, like I said, I think dealing with change on different timescales and sort of always being in the habit that testing, refactoring, and documentation in the form of good tests, good stories, is something that evolves alongside the project. I think I can understand why a lot of people prefer doing things that way. Now remember, at the beginning of the class, one of the things we emphasized was this doesn't mean that Agile is the right approach for every project. Projects that are operating in safety critical environments or very heavily regulated environments, or where the customer is not going to be available to help with the ongoing evolution after deployment, those are cases where it probably is more prudent to use a plan and document approach. So to that end, I think we can sort of summarize what some of the differences are in how maintenance is handled in these two different worlds. Change requests in the P&D world kind of correspond to low-level user, short user stories that indicate a feature the customer would like to have. Doing change requests and estimating how long that will take. In the P&D world, there's a maintenance manager whose job it is to figure that out and present it to the change control board. But in Agile, we've already talked about different mechanisms for breaking down user stories into smaller pieces, working with the team to sort of come up with an estimate of the number of points, essentially just doing everything at a finer granularity. Deciding which change requests get prioritized. The change control board does it in a traditional organization, but we've talked about how the development team, along with customer participation, can prioritize the stories into a backlog and prioritize people grabbing stories in that order. So really, a lot of these roles in Agile are essentially taken over by the development team. Just like you're responsible for much more of your own testing, you're responsible for keeping your code documented, for keeping it clean, and for participating in the process of deciding which customer requests are most important, how do we prioritize them, how do we estimate the effort it will take. So, as we might think, if 2/3 of the costs of operating a software product really are in the maintenance phase, you might think, well, then it makes sense to ask whether the same processes you use for writing the code can also be used for maintaining the code. And that's kind of my summary of why I like the Agile approach to software maintenance. It really is saying, The only difference is we're embracing change on different timescales, but fundamentally, the processes we're using for maintaining and enhancing are the same ingredients that we're using when the code is first being developed.